the Father. They're not causally generated by the Father.
Well, if we say, for example, if we're talking about mathematics or any types of abstraction, if you talk about, for example, propositional logic or modal logic or anything else, then really we're not talking about things necessarily, unless you're a modal realist or like a Platonic realist, that have an actual ontological status.
I think they do have a positive ontological status. I think if they didn't, then I think it would make, insofar as truth is correspondence with reality, then it would make our modal and mathematical claims false if there were no...
Why is that? So, for example, if someone took a Kantian view, is that we impose, for example, mathematics onto the world rather than mathematics is something standalone which we take and we conceive from the world, would that mean that you can't do maths if you take that view?
Well, I think it would mean that the mathematical facts are not true. So
is that true?
Well, so consider a sentence like the fact there are, like the statement, there are infinite prime numbers. Statements of the form there are x are true if and only if there exist the things in question. If and only if there exists x. And so statements of the form... No,
exist in what sense? If we're saying exist...
So statements of the form there are infinite prime numbers is true only if there exist infinite prime numbers.
Yeah, but if they only exist in what sense? So this is where the age-old debate between nominalists and conceptualists and Neoplatonists is. I'm saying that you could conceive of
a conceptualist. It's incompatible, I think, with nominalism, but it's compatible with either a relative.
No, but it's a different sense. So a conceptualist would say, for example, 2 + 2 = 4 is true in the mind. Okay, so they wouldn't say that it's true because it has an ontological status which is outside. You can't put 2 + 2 = 4 under a microscope from that paradigm. So once again, before we start talking about this has a dependency relationship with this, we're talking about things with a cosmological significance. Because at the end of the day, if you don't do that, then you're going to fall into what Immanuel Kant said is that existence is not a predicate. That the whole thing is a mental exercise. And that's why I think the ontological argument can have weaknesses for God's existence. Because it's mostly based on kind of like these conceptions. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, so I don't accept that there are no robustly objective facts about mathematics and sets and so on. But for example, do you think that the moral facts come from God?
Yeah,
so the moral facts are necessary, but nonetheless they depend on God. There can be all sorts of dependence relations between necessary facts.
Yeah, no. So you're saying there's dependence relations. Yeah, but here's what I'm saying is that we're equivocating in our use of the word dependence. Come. Pay for me, pay for him as well. I pay for both. No problem, yeah? No pay for him, the other guy, no. For both, I'm paying for it. For two of them. It's okay, because these chairs, you need to pay for them.
Oh, I see. Wow.
Don't worry about it anytime. Don't worry. Yeah? Well, what's your name, my friend? You're from Nigeria? Oh, fantastic. You like the jollof? I like it too. Fantastic. I might go to Ghana. I want to go again. I've been there before. I like it. It's a very beautiful place.
So
yeah.
Question. Okay, so you were explaining...
I was saying that, okay, so we have to be clear what we mean by dependency or contingency here, yeah? Because if we talk about contingency in the mathematical sense, you can actually make an argument that that's not really... You said that, well, some mathematicians, philosophers of mathematics, say that mathematics depends on... set theory. Well, that's not actually a consensus view, and you will know Kurt Gödel's view on the matter. You'll know the incompleteness model, which actually showed that there's a circularity in the axiomatic presuppositions of mathematics to the extent to which it actually acts in a paradoxical way, in the same way as the question or the statement that this statement is false or the liar paradox is also paradoxical. So there is no conclusion about how what mathematics depends on from an axiomatic perspective. There is no conclusion.
So the idea that math depends on set theory, that I agree that is controversial. I don't actually have much of a view on that. The idea that certain mathematical facts depend on other mathematical facts is much less controversial. So it's
like, give me an example.
So for example, any probability fact will depend on the truth of the basic axioms of probability.
Okay, I think the way you're using dependence here is not correct, I think. Because, for example, Leibniz had a very interesting way of understanding this when he was talking about the principle of sufficient reason. And he's got many books where you can refer to. They're very small books. I would actually recommend them. Obviously, he's a good person to refer to because he was a mathematician. They say that he invented calculus, but at the same time, he was a philosopher. So what his idea was in terms of truth statements or propositional statements and or mathematical statements was that the truth of the proposition was contained within that proposition. So mathematics, a lot of it is actually tautological. Equations are tautological.
I don't agree that that mathematical claims are primarily tautological. In fact, I actually think Gödel gave reasons to think that's not true, right? So insofar as Gödel showed, no system of axioms can be both complete in that it describes all the true mathematical facts.
Yeah.
And not contain any contradictions. Well, then what that means is that no system of axioms can by itself exhaust all the relevant mathematical facts. But I mean,
Now let's go back to the point of tautology, right?
Okay.
So 2 + 2 = 4, or 5 + 5 = 10. The equal sign in the middle. Positions, right? Which means that on the one hand, 5 + 5 is equivalent to, it's another way of expressing the idea of 10. So according to this idea, if we're talking about, if mathematics is, for the most part, tautological, then they're truisms. So in other words, it's not...
The view that mathematical statements are just basically tautologies has fallen largely out of favor among philosophers of mathematics as a result of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. But I mean, the point I'm making, it won't hinge on any particularly controversial views in philosophy of math. So, for example, do you think, there are various facts about propositions. So the following, here's a fact. Either 2 + 2 = 4, or pigs can fly. That fact depends on the truth that 2 + 2 = 4. But nonetheless, it's not caused by that truth.
So what's the point you're making?
The point is there are a whole range of perfectly intelligible instances whereby things depend on, whereby necessary facts depend on other necessary facts. If there are a whole range of things like that,
So
what's wrong with the Trinity?
Here's the thing. So I don't know if you've read Edward Fazer. He's quite an interesting figure. He's got some interesting things. One thing I like from him is what he talks about, the principle of proportionate causality, okay? And that's something Muslim scholars have been saying for a long time as well, which is something bereft of equality cannot produce it, yeah? Something bereft of equality cannot produce it. Now,
what do you mean by bereft of equality?
something doesn't have something, cannot give it. Yes? Something that does not have something cannot give it, yeah? This is the principle of proportionate causality. Now, what I'm saying is that for me, the best explanation for all things related to necessary facts is actually a necessary existence, and I'll tell you why. The idea of existence, whether you're an essentialist, an Aristotelian essentialist or not, the idea of existence presupposes every other idea. It's the mother category of all ideas. And so if there is such a thing as a necessary existence, then the existence of necessary facts like 2 + 2 = 4, or whatever it may be, I would say the best explanation for that is actually the necessary existence. That they are produced by the necessary existence.
Okay, well, I think that's perfectly fine. And in fact, that wouldn't be incompatible with what I said. It would, in fact, bolster the point that there are necessary facts where those necessary facts depend on other necessary facts.
No, but the reason why it's different from what you said is you're saying that there's dependency relations, all right? So necessary facts. I'm not saying that the dependency relation is between a necessary fact and another necessary fact. I'm saying that the ultimate dependency relation is between a necessary fact and a necessary existence.
Right, okay, so you have a necessary being,
yeah,
and then you have certain necessary facts that depend on the necessary being.
Sure.
You have certain things that exist that depend on the necessary being?
Everything that exists depends on necessary being.
Right, okay, so you have other things that exist necessarily and depend on the necessary being.
Independently.
No, I didn't say independently.
Oh, sorry.
They exist
yeah,
necessarily, and
sure,
they depend on the necessary being.
Sure.
Okay, right, so then what's wrong with that being true with the Trinity?
Okay, so I don't see how...
With the Son and the Spirit existing necessarily, but being dependent on the Father.
Okay, so no, this is what we're saying is there's multiple contradictions in the idea of the Trinity, right? The first one is the proposition that the Jesus is God, which means that he's a necessary being. Jesus must be a necessary being. And if he's a necessary being, at the same time as being generated, begotten, and caused by something which is necessary, then that negates his necessity. You can't be caused and uncaused at the same time. Necessity means you're uncaused.
Right, so it's not that he's caused, it's that he's dependent on the Father.
Even that.
Right, so, but But necessity doesn't mean that you're not dependent on anything, because you just agreed that there are necessary facts
Say again?
dependent on God. Necessity doesn't mean not being dependent on anything, because you just agreed that there are necessary facts that depend on God.
So say that one more time.
Being necessary doesn't mean not depending on anything.
It does mean that.
Because you agreed earlier that there are necessary facts that depend on
all right. No, okay, good, excellent. Now I understand your point. So I think for Muslim scholars and philosophers and thinkers have differentiated between something which is necessary as a result of itself and necessary due to another. Okay, so in other words, they say something which is wajibli nafsihi, which is necessary because of itself. The only thing which is necessary due to itself or self-sufficient in the absolute sense is the self-subsistent necessary being, right? But you can have anything, we can have lots of things which are actually necessary due to another. So from one perspective, you're a contingent being. I'm a contingent being. That tree over there is a contingent being. But from another perspective, me and you and that tree are actually necessary. Necessary because they emanate from a necessary thing. So this is a kind of, if you believe in determinism or compatibilism, that will be the conclusion that you come to. So what I'm saying is that 2 + 2 = 4 is necessary as a fact, but it's not necessary in the sense that it has ontological self-subsistence. And that's the difference.
Right. So what Christians generally claim is that God has ontological self-subsistence.
Sure.
And that the Son doesn't have self-subsistence in that respect.
No,
that's dependent on God.
No, that's not what they say. They say they're co-equal and co-eternal. So if God has self-subsistence,
what I said is perfectly compatible.
No, it's not. That is subordinationism. What you've described is actually a form of subordinationism, which is considered now heretical in all 3 churches. So now, if you consider that Jesus is subordinate in any sense, in a dependent relationship with God, or with the Father, that indicates actually that Jesus is not God. And that's the point where Muslims have been trying to make. And this is exactly, in fact, for example...
It's not that Jesus is dependent on God, it's that Jesus is dependent on the Father.
Sure.
That the Father...
But the Father is God.
The Son, which is just the standard Christian view.
What I'm saying to you is that if the Father is God, and Jesus is God, and Jesus is dependent on the Father, that indicates that you have something which is meant to be necessary, which is actually contingent and dependent, which is a contradiction of necessity. It's a very simple thing to understand.
So God is not dependent on anything. Jesus is dependent on the Father, but it doesn't make God dependent, because God, as 3 persons, is not dependent.
Sure, but you're defining God in 2 different senses. Is Jesus God?
Yes.
Okay. Is the Father God?
Yes.
Is the Holy Spirit God?
Well, I'm not a Christian, but I'm.
But you're saying yes.
But I think
Okay, but these are Christian beliefs. I mean, that's what makes you a Christian. Okay. So let's say, for example, you believe that the Father is God. Okay. What does it mean to be God? Everyone agrees that what it means to be God is to be necessary. Everyone agrees. Do you want some? Do you want water? Are you sure? You can have it if you want.
No, thank
Yeah, all right.
Well,
okay.
Richard Swinburne, for instance, doesn't think God is necessary.
Yeah, but he also has lots of ideas, Richard Swinburne, which are really problematic. He's been refuted by someone called Scott Williamson. I don't know if you've come across this.
I was just disagreeing with your claim that everyone agrees that to be God is to be necessary.
No. So Richard Swinburne, the exception doesn't exemplify the rule. The majority of scholars, he has views. Richard Swinburne has views which actually go against the majority of scholars. For example, when he's describing the relationship between the Father and the Son, and he was asked in a peer-reviewed paper by someone called Scott Williamson, to outline where there's something called necessary agreement between the 3 wills of God, such that, and this is the example he gave, that if the Father wanted the Son to go around the earth, or if the Father wanted the Son to go around one way and the Son wanted the Son to go around the other, where would the Son go? Yeah. So obviously Christians have to say, well, the Son will go in one direction because there's actually uniformity of wills. Richard Swinburne, alongside other social Trinitarians, actually believe the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit have 3 distinct wills. If that's the case, how is it? So Richard Swinburne responds.
Swinburne does not think that.
He does that, but he believes that. And then he says it. And then so what happens is, Swinburne says the way that he can Eucharist, and this is what Scott Williamson responds to. He says that the way in which the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit actually agree on something is because the Father is a parental relationship. This is what he says. And I've read this very recently, so I know what I'm talking about. He says there's a parental relationship between the Father and the Son, whereby the Father is, because he's the parent, he's the Father, he has to obey the Son, basically. Sorry, the Son has to obey the Father, yeah? It's like your dad has to obey the son. Scott Williamson responds to him in that paper about necessary agreement, which you can get online, yeah? And he says to him in the paper, why would it be the case that this would be the mechanism by which and through which you would accept necessary agreement? Necessary agreement between the wills of God. And that's another area. So you've got one issue of contradiction, we said already. One issue of contradiction is the fact that you believe that the Son is begotten, or in the words of the Cappadocian Fathers, he's generated. In the words of the Cappadocian Fathers, he's caused. They use the word cause openly. A necessary thing cannot be caused. If the Son, and that, by the way, this is the Quranic argument. The Quran says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Yeah? Say he is Allah, one and only. Allahu Samad. That he is self-subsistent. He is independent. He is self-sufficient. Lam yalid walam yulad. He does not beget nor is he begotten. Walam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. And there is nothing comparable unto him. Now, notice how it says lam yalid walam yulad. Because being begotten is a nullifier to self-subsistence. So Allah is responding directly to Christians. He's saying, if God is necessary, if Jesus is necessary, if he's independent, if he's truly self-subsistent, if he's truly self-sufficient, he could not have been begotten, because if he has been begotten, that would indicate subordination, dependency, causality, causation, and it would indicate a lack of necessity.
Okay, so it wouldn't indicate a lack of necessity because, as we've already discussed, things...
In the ultimate sense.
Well, so it sounds like by necessity what you really mean is independence.
Yes.
Right, okay, so I think that in this sense, God would be independent. It would just be that...
Would Jesus be independent?
Jesus would be dependent on the Father.
That's exactly the point. So we're saying that, okay, so this is, we've got to it now.
We need to distinguish, because you need to distinguish between the dependence and the independence of God as the divine nature and the dependence or the independence of individual divine persons. Right, so it's not problematic. So like, let's see, what's a good analogy? So it's, here's something that one might affirm, that God exists necessarily, and as a result of God's necessary existence, he necessarily knows that he exists. Okay, if he affirms, if a person affirms that, they would say that God's knowledge, it's necessary. Now his knowledge would depend on his nature, but that's not a contradiction, and that wouldn't negate its necessity.
Okay, so you've just admitted something quite significant, and I think you need to pay attention to what you said yourself. You said Jesus is dependent, okay? He's dependent on the Father. Okay, so in that respect, would you concede that the Father has a kind of ability that the Son does not have?
No.
Okay, now this is a contradiction.
He has a property that the Son doesn't have.
Okay.
The Father has a property that the Son doesn't have.
So, and is that property allow the Father to do something that it doesn't allow the Son to do?
When you say allow, it's not like the Father has powers that the Son doesn't have.
Well, you just said the Father is independent. Okay, well, this doesn't sound... I don't think you're convinced by this yourself. You're a clever man. Clearly, you're not convinced by this yourself. You are not.
Why? As I said, I'm not a Christian. I just don't think there's
you're saying that, but you are. But here's the thing.
No, I'm not.
No, yeah. So let's get back to this. If we're saying Jesus is God, and what it means to be God is to be independent, because if you're dependent, and this is, by the way, this is a classic aspect of the Quranic argument. It says, "Kana yakulani ta'am," that him and his mother, Jesus and his mum, used to eat food, meaning they were dependent. It's trying to get you to understand that if there's a dependent being, then that dependent being is disqualified from being God, because to be God is to be independent and self-subsistent. If you've just admitted Jesus is dependent on the Father. If Jesus is dependent on the Father, it follows the Father is the true God and Jesus is not the true God. Jesus was created by the Father. He was generated by the Father. He is dependent on the Father. This is what the Muslim belief is.
Okay, so I don't think that's right. So was 7-year-old Mohammed Hijab Mohammed Hijab?
In what sense?
Like, was the 7-year-old version of you Mohammed Hijab?
In what sense?
In the sense of being Mohammed Hijab.
Depends on how you define Mohammed Hijab. So if you define it by... it mind or body? It's a mind or body issue. Is it a soul? So if for example,
I mean it in the sense where that you'd mean if you ask, is Muhammad Hijab here? If you'd ask that when 7-year-old Muhammad Hijab was here, it would be correct to answer yes.
No, in one sense you cannot answer it like that. In another sense, it's not the case, because if I believe that the human being is a composite of mind and body, the body that I've got now, which is completely different to the body I had at 7 years old, almost every single cell in my body has been replaced. Okay, so which means that from a body perspective, I'm different. So am I the same? No. Muhammad Hijab is then the same as how would he have been dealt with the same?
I'm not asking if they're identical to you today. I'm asking if it would be true to say that person is Muhammad Hijab.
In one sense, it would be true. In another sense, it would not be true.
Right. So the sense in which it's true, the sense of just describing who they are. So in a similar way to how you would say of 7-year-old Muhammad Hijab and 14-year-old Muhammad Hijab and 21-year-old Muhammad Hijab, that each of them are Muhammad Hijab, but nonetheless you wouldn't say that 7-year-old Muhammad Hijab is 14-year-old Muhammad Hijab. In a similar way with the Trinity, you'd say that that the Father and the Son and the Spirit are not identical to each other, but they are each God.
Why is it similar?
Well, because in both cases there's some claim about the nature and the essence of the being,
okay.
And the fact that there's a commonality in the essence doesn't mean that the individual members that instantiate the essence are the same as each other.
Do you accept that the human being is composed of mind and body? Do you agree with mind and body dualism?
I'm kind of undecided.
You can't even have this analogy unless you get to the bottom of this question.
Well, I think either we're a composite of mind and body, or we're just a soul, essentially.
So then,
but fine,
if
we can talk.
if you don't have a strong idea of what a human being is, you can't ask this question. Is the human being mind and body or not?
Well, I largely think it's a semantic question. I think our essential property is just the possession of our souls.
It's not a semantic problem. You know very well. You've studied philosophy. So this is a question that's plagued the minds of philosophers for a long time. Either you believe in mind-body dualism or you don't. So you haven't answered the question. Because with your analogy...
I do believe in mind-body dualism.
Okay, sure. So if you believe in mind-body dualism, then the question is, Muhammad Hijab at 7 years old, is he the same as Muhammad Hijab at 33 right now? The answer is no. The answer is no, it's not actually.
Yeah, that was my point.
Yeah, it's not the same.
But it's true that you, when you were 7, it would have been true to say Muhammad Hijab exists. The 7-year-old.
What it meant to be Muhammad Hijab when I was 7 is different to what it means when I was 33.
I don't think it's true that what it meant is different.
Yeah, of course it is. If you believe in mind-body dualism, a 6'7", 120 kilogram guy is different from a little 20 kilogram boy. Do you agree with that? Whose cells have completely changed every single cell of his body.
It's true that the being that made it true, the truth maker for their Muhammad Hijab existing, was different when you were 7 than you today. So here's an analogy. 10 years ago, it would have been true to say, the following sentence would have been true: there are people at the park. And today, it would have been true to say there are people at the park. It's different people that are making it true that there are people at the park. So it's a different version of Muhammad Hijab.
If I took this chair that I'm sitting on, and I replaced each aspect of this chair with another material, I took this and put a plastic one, and I put here and I put a red one, not a green one, yeah? Would it be the same chair or would it be a different chair?
I have sort of weird views on this, but I
What's
think.
The answer?
So I think that there will be two distinct worms, objects that stretch through time, one of which is composed of the old chair and the new chair, and one of which is not, and then it's just a semantic question which one you're referring to. So I'm what's called a Mereological universalist. So I think that every collection of distinct Mereological symbols forms its own composite object. So there's an object composed of
even on the view, I'm asking a simple question. If I took this chair, I replaced each aspect of this chair with another material. Is it the same chair or is it a different chair?
Well, I was giving my answer, but you didn't seem very satisfied with it. It would be when you ask, is it the same chair or is it a different chair? There's one object composed of the chair at both times. So there's one object on which it's the same. There's one object on which it's different. Well, actually, there are a lot of objects on which it's the same and different. So, let's see.
At the point where everything has been replaced. So, for example, if I take these glasses and I replace this with a white one, yeah? this one with a white one, this here with a white one, and I changed the lenses, and I changed this thing as well. If you took your glasses, you went to Specsavers, yeah, and you tell them fix it, they say no problem, we're gonna fix it, yeah, and then they changed each aspect of the glasses. Your glasses now, they changed this one like that into white, everything, even the bolts, everything is changed. They just keep changing things. Would you go back and say, these are not my glasses, or would you say these are my glasses? Let me take them. Simple question.
Well, I think that, like, okay, here's an analogy.
I've got the joke version of this. I've had this broom for like 20 years. And he goes, I've replaced the head 5 times and the handle 5 times as well.
Exactly.
Because there's only 2 parts.
Yeah. So consider any atom at the periphery of that chair, and then ask, is that atom part of the chair? Well, there's one way of defining the chair on which the atom's part of it. There's one way of defining the chair on which the atom's not part of it. My account of this is that there are distinct composite objects, distinct and overlapping composite objects composed of different assemblies of matter. So there's a composite object that is the chair with the atom, and another one that's composed of the chair without the atom. And it's a semantic question about which of those you're talking about.
This is a scientific question.
You're jumping on the word semantic, but you're not getting my point. My point is, if there are 2 objects, one of which contains the extra atom and the other one doesn't, it is a semantic question which one you're talking about.
Okay. So if you went to the Specsavers and you gave your glasses, and they changed each part of your
This guy is a second fighter.
Stop it, man. Stop it.
Thank God he's gone.
This is embarrassing, man. They need to.
I can't really, sensibly challenge people to fights over philosophy disputes. I don't think it would go great for me.
Okay, so going back to the point we were making about dependency. Going back to the dependency, do you see that there's what is dependency, first of all? How do you understand it?
So, it's a bit hard to define precisely. Something is dependent if, for it to be the case, it requires another thing.
Whether it's dependent on
something which is reliant on something else for its existence.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Okay, so if you're saying Jesus is that, how can you see that Jesus is God and that at the same time? That's all my question is. Simple.
Well, because the things that are true of God as the divine nature are not the same as the things that are true of every member of every particular divine person. Right. So this is
you're not answering my question. You're making another point.
I'm not making another point.
Okay,
I was answering.
No, but how is Jesus God and how is he dependent and God at the same time?
Because all the properties that are true of the divine nature in the sense of being God in that sense are not true of each member of the Trinity. So you're assuming that whatever. So you're assuming that whatever is true of each of the divine persons has to be true of God.
So
but that's the entire the entire premise of the Trinity is rejecting that idea.
Is Jesus a part of God?
There are different accounts on which.
What's your account?
Well, as I say, I'm not a Christian. I was just disagreeing that you could spell
No,
it.
but what is your account?
Well, I don't believe in the Trinity.
Okay, so why are we talking about this?
Well, because I don't think there's. So you are. I don't think that you are suggesting that there was a contradiction in the Trinity. I don't think there's a contradiction.
Okay. Well,
at some point, you'd have to either suggest that it's made of parts, or you say that he's not.
But yeah, I guess if were I to be a Trinitarian, I think I would affirm that the divine persons are parts of God.
Oh, you would, yeah.
I would, yeah.
In what sense? In the sense that they can be disassembled? Like the chair?
No,
like the glasses?
I don't think that Trinitarians would affirm that they can be disassembled.
Okay, so in what sense are they parts?
Well, they're distinct such that the things that are true. They're distinct from God in the sense that the things that are true of them are not necessarily true of God.
You're aware that partialism is a heresy?
Which council condemned partialism?
All of them.
I actually don't think that's true. I did a little bit of looking into this.
Partialism is heresy.
Okay, where is partialism condemned?
Every single Eastern Orthodox Church.
No,
Catholic
well
Church.
that's not a council. That's a church.
I don't know what council, but I know it's a heresy. Partialism council.
I don't think it's a heresy.
Put it on ChatGPT. You'll see.
Okay. Well,
partialism is a heresy.
I've done some googling about this, and I don't think it's a heresy.
No, I can assure you it's a heresy.
Okay. Anyone want to Google, is partialism a heresy?
Yeah. No, the reason why I say that is because I came across something from William Craig, where he was saying that he was actually affirming a kind of partialism. Yeah. So I went and searched what other people are saying about that, and I realized that his contemporaries and his colleagues were calling him heretic for believing in that. So. And they came from different schools of thought. So some Catholics would say that his idea of it is a heretical.
Yeah.
So that's the thing with Christianity. You either go into fallacy or heresy.
It is a heresy.
It's a heresy. I told you.
Wait, where does it?
According to ChatGPT, he told me to.
Okay, wait, and can you ask what
sources?
counts?
Yeah, ask the sources.
Okay, sources, please.
Wait, so can I just see what ChatGPT said on the matter?
Actually, I'll give you a fresh page.
Isn't it enough that Jesus was a mighty
Ask
prophet?
him from a fresh page, just whatever you wish.
Oh yeah.
All the prophets before him.
Yeah.
You get yourself in incredible confusion, and you don't know what you're talking about no more.
It depends. I didn't read all of it. I just saw orthodoxy as a heresy, but then I didn't continue. But I see.
Yeah, and partialism is a heresy. Trust me.
Muslims believe in Jesus.
That's the thing. With Christianity, they will either have to leave their religion to try and justify it, to try and make sense of it, or they can affirm their religion and create fallacies.
Yeah, what it feels like to be a Christian is like bending your legs in some way, or your arms, just to fit in. It just doesn't
Not
work.
unless, if only it was like that.
Who was behind all this big lie, which is Paul?
Yeah.
And his people.
Yeah.
They turned the whole thing.
Absolutely, and that's another point.
Never really kind of discussed that.
They should discuss it. The historical point of how Trinity transforms. Yeah, absolutely. Like for example, the Holy Spirit, right? He made a good point. He said that the development of the Trinity, the historical development of the Trinity, yeah. With the historical development
Partialism,
of the Trinity,
as a specific heresy, was not formally condemned by name at any ecumenical council.
until
That's the end of the sentence.
Okay.
So
keep researching it.
Yeah. So the next after that it says, however, its core idea was implicitly condemned by the early church councils that defined Orthodox Trinitarian doctrine. No, wait. Well, hold on. So what? There's dispute about whether it counts as a heresy because
No.
What is heretical is to think that the Father, Son, and the Spirit are not themselves God. But it's not heretical to. But if you have a version of partialism on which you think they all count as God, then.
But that's what you believe. You just said that you believe Jesus is
as
God.
I said, I don't affirm the truth.
You said that you believe Jesus is God, and you also said that you believe Jesus is part of God.
I think I was saying that sort of wearing the Christian hat. But to be clear, I don't think Jesus
So
is God.
I'm
not a Christian.
You don't believe it no more, yeah?
Well, I didn't believe it before.
Okay, how about you?
I can find
what's
you.
the name again?
Matthew.
Matthew, sorry, I forgot to take your name. How about you think about Islam now? Because let's be honest, let's be honest. I think that your mind, your critical mind, and your ability to understand.
I think Islam is way more obviously false than Christianity.
Tell me why. You said Islam is false. Give me a reason why Islam is false. Go on.
Sure. So
your strongest argument.
Okay, so I think the extended. I think there are a lot of arguments. The extended digression in hell, where they describe, boiling off the skins of people and then bringing them back on, and then boiling it off repeatedly.
Sure.
This does not seem like the actions of a perfectly loving and merciful God.
That's a moral argument.
No, that's a.
I agree, it's a moral argument.
That's not a divine That's not a creedal disproven argument. It's not an undercutter to the religion of Islam.
Yeah,
so,
moral argument.
if you believe that hellfire is something which God wouldn't do, you don't even know what God is. You think that God is dependent. You think God is Jesus. You think God is a part of God and God at the same time.
Okay, what I was saying earlier was I think that I disagree with you that there's some explicit contradiction in the Trinity. Now, I don't affirm the Trinity. I'm not a Christian.
What's the explicit contradiction of a God putting people in hellfire and
I don't think it's an explicit contradiction. I also don't think here's another belief that's not.
So it's not a contradiction.
Yeah.
So it's not false then.
No. That's absolutely wrong. There are lots of beliefs that are false, but that aren't a contradiction. Error theory, for instance, which affirms that there are no moral facts. I think error theory is absolutely wrong, but there's no contradiction.
How would you disprove it if not with the proof of contradiction? Give me another proof. Why is it wrong? In what respect?
So I'm what's called a phenomenal conservative, where I think the way we figure out what's true is we look at the way that things seem, and then we have default trust in the way that things seem, unless there's a strong reason to doubt it.
Yeah, like Swinburne. And that's what he believes as well.
I'm a big Swinburne fan. But
he called this something else actually. He called it the credulity, something else.
The principle of credulity.
Yeah, principle of credulity, isn't it? Yeah.
And I suppose by the hypothesis that Jesus is God. That is to say.
You look a bit like him, but maybe a younger version.
Yeah. So I think, and absent relying on the principle that things are as they seem prior to being given a strong reason to doubt it, we would basically be in, complete nihilism, skepticism land, where if you get down to any of our foundational beliefs, I think they'll just depend on things that are really obvious. And I find the notion that, that it's wrong to torment people forever in, arbitrarily horrible ways, that's immoral, that you shouldn't do that. Particularly if it's in your power to redeem them. I find that to be about as obvious as any ethical truth, I believe.
Yeah, but you're saying that. Here's the thing. For example, right, Swinburne in his book about God, I forget the name of the book, but he made an argument from base theory. I don't know if you've come across it.
Yeah. And
he was basically making a probabilistic argument that God is probably the best explanation for the existence of the universe, etc. The point is that you haven't even attempted to do that. So you've just said something. You said that I believe in things are true unless I'm given it. This is the principle of credulity that Swinburne believes in. You believe that things are true unless you are given explicit reason for them not to be true.
Hold on. That is not the principle that I was espousing. The principle is if something seems true, you have a reason to think it's true, absent a reason to doubt.
That's an important distinction. Fine. So if something seems true, unless you're given a reason not to believe it. Now here's the point. On what basis you look at, for example, eternal punishment in hellfire? And on what basis can you falsify that? Because if that's your strongest argument against Islam.
Why I don't know if it's my strongest. I think there are many.
Well, it seems like you mentioned it, so it must be very strong in your eyes. You must see that as a very strong argument.
I do, yeah.
Okay, so you can't explain to me what the tension is, why that makes it false.
Okay, so here's a very obvious ethical principle that we all accept in ordinary life. If you're going to cause others suffering, you need to have some justification for it. If I were to stab you in the eye, and you ask me why did I do that, and I say I have no justification, I'm just doing it, right? Then it would be pretty clear that, I was acting wrongly. And so then the question is, okay, so are there goods commensurate with torturing people forever that make it justified to torture people forever in pursuit of those goods? So then the question is, okay, is there a plausible story on which there are such goods? And so what are the goods?
Yeah, so you've just made my argument for me in the sense that you said that you're basically saying that if you punish somebody for no crime, then that's a kind of injustice. That's basically what you're saying, right? And I'm saying I don't disagree with that proposition. But for example, when the Quran talks about the boiling of the skin, actually it's talking about the hypocrites, the religious hypocrites, the ones who posed as Muslims and then they pretended and they rejected they were infidels in that sense. They rejected the message of truth. And that's why it says, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ فِي الدَّرْكِ الْأَسْفَلِ مِنَ النَّارِ, that certainly the hypocrites, the religious hypocrites, are in the lower pits of the hellfire. كُلَّمَا نَضِجَتْ جُلُودُهُمْ بَدَّلْنَاهُمْ جُلُودًا غَيْرَهَا لِيُذُوقُوا الْعَذَابِ. That every time their skins fall off, we have replaced them with skins that are actually different to their skins so that they can taste the punishment. But in the same exact chapter that Allah says that, which is chapter 4, Allah also mentions مَا يَفْعَلُ اللَّهُ بِعَذَابِكُمْ إِن شَكَرْتُمْ وَآمَنْتُمْ. That what would Allah do with your punishment if you are grateful and you are believers? So in other words, it's making it clear that there is a justification for the punishment, which is the ingratitude, the ultimate ingratitude of the human condition, or the human being, the disbeliever, and the ultimate disbelief of these are the two things which this verse indicates are the justifications for someone in hellfire forever. Now you might think that that's unfair in your mind, but then that's a subjective value judgment. That's an aesthetic value judgment. There's no way
it's not an aesthetic judgment. It's a moral judgment.
Yeah, based on what?
well, based on the same things that all moral judgments are based on, which is ultimately some combination of seemings, some combination of direct seemings and efforts to make other beliefs that are based on seemings coherent.
Okay, it seems like your philosophy of logic and maths is much stronger than your ethics, because here you're not giving a good account of your ethical system.
I know way more about ethics than about philosophy of logic.
Okay, well, tell me now why. On what basis? First of all, you have to explain what is your ethical system.
Understand, the question you're asking me is a question you could ask about any ethical claim that a person makes.
How can you ascertain that a claim is ethically or morally false? What's your standard?
So what you do is you look at the things that are really ethically obvious, the things that seem really obviously the case in ethics, and then you look at whether sort of the balance of those things favor or disfavor the claim. So if a claim, so suppose I say it's great to torture people, okay? You can all be really confident that that claim is false because it's really obvious that that claim is false. And in fact, it being obvious that claim is false is more obvious than any argument you're going to give.
Here's the thing.
I'm not saying it's subjective. I'm saying we know. No, it's not subjective.
How is that? Is it subjective?
No, but here's the thing.
It's objectively wrong to torture babies.
The issue is that you're not proposing a mechanism. So, for example, in Western ethical systems, there are three main schools of thought. One of them is the Kantian deontological school, which I'm sure you know, which is, for example, underpinned by something like the categorical imperative and or the hypothetical imperative. Then you've got consequentialism, okay, under which falls utilitarianism and under which is actually liberalism or social liberalism, because social liberalism is the birth child actually of utilitarianism. Of course, John Stuart Mill was both. He was the father of social liberalism and utilitarianism. Then you've got virtue ethics of the ancient Greeks. These are the three, and of course, Alistair McIntyre has written a book, an interesting one, about after ethics, and I actually believe
after virtue.
After virtue. I actually believe that, my opinion is, the best things the Westerners have actually brought in terms of ethical systems is actually virtue ethics, rather than the other two, which is ironic because it's regressed in my view, as is the view of Alistair McIntyre as well. But the point I'm making to you is this: is that these three systems are giving you a reason why things are right and wrong. So, for example, Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics will talk to you about excesses and deficiencies, and then the golden mean. If you're a coward, that's bad. If you're hasty, that's bad. Being brave is right in the middle. He's giving you something to think about. Consequentialists will do the same thing. They'll say that we look at something being bad and right based on the consequences it has in society. Deontological ethics or Kant will say, if everyone does something in society, we can see if that thing is right or wrong.
Right. So you can.
So, but here you're not proposing a mechanism.
Right. So you can of course get so. Suppose someone's torturing babies and you want to argue they're doing something wrong. It would not be the right way to go to say, okay, first virtue ethics is right. Oh, and then virtue ethics implies that you shouldn't torture babies. And the reason why that wouldn't be the way to go is that it's way more obvious that it's wrong to torture babies than any particular view of normative ethics. A view of normative ethics will be way more controversial than the idea that it's wrong to torture babies for fun. Now, in a similar way, when Peter Singer's arguing that for ethical vegetarianism, he doesn't say, okay, premise one, utilitarianism's right, and then if utilitarianism's right, then we have an obligation not to eat animals. No, he doesn't do that.
He might not do it in that. He's definitely utilitarian.
I agree. Peter Singer is a utilitarian.
And we know that he's utilitarian.
No, you're not getting my point.
Yeah.
I agree. Peter Singer is a utilitarian.
Sure.
In fact, that was that fact is essential to my point. But when Peter Singer's arguing for, say, our obligations to give nearly all of our wealth to charity or the wrongness of meat eating, he does not argue for it by saying premise one, utilitarianism is correct. If
why does he have to do it in that systematic fashion?
Well, he doesn't even do it in a less systematic fashion.
No, but
what he does is he appeals to obvious ethical judgments that are even going to be shared by deontologists and virtue ethicists, and then he argues that those obvious ethical judgments imply.
What was his view on disabled babies again? That you kill them or something, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm not.
I don't want to misrepresent him, but the point is that you can assume that he's making these value judgments based on the fact that he has an ethical system which has justified this. Now, what you're essentially doing is you're negating the principle of sufficient reason, because we're saying that The question at hand here is, do moral truths need a sufficient reason to be either true or false? If you're saying that, so for example, if you say killing a baby, why is it wrong? It's wrong because, and then there's a reason that someone can give. You're saying that you don't need to actually offer a justification.
No, I'm not saying you don't need to offer a justification. Well, I mean, actually, I would, like, it depends on exactly what you mean by a justification, but I think you have to give a sufficient reason for it, but often just the obviousness of a principle itself can be a sufficient reason for it on pain of regress.
No, but that's
Hold on. So, this does not deny the principle of sufficient reason, because I'm not making a claim about ontology. I'm not saying that there are ethical truths that simply float freely without. Can I finish the point? So, what I'm saying is that the way we figure out proximate ethical judgments is not by first figuring out a grand theory of morality and then deriving all the ethical judgments from the grand theory. Instead, what it makes sense to do is you look at obvious mid-level principles. So there are going to be obvious. So for example, if you're arguing for utilitarianism, you might say, here's a really obvious ethical judgment. The better than relation is transitive. So if A is better than B and B is better than C, then A is better than C. And then you point out that there are sort of these tricky cases where non-utilitarian views will either have to violate transitivity or some other plausible ethical principle, right? So you don't start with the broad ethical framework and then use that to derive all the proximate first-order judgments. If anything, it often goes the other way, where you start with first-order judgments and then you look at the most plausible ethical view for systematizing the correct first-order judgments.
So are you saying that when you start with, in your estimation, when you're starting with these judgments, are you doing so on an epistemological level? Is it an epistemological value?
Yeah.
Sure. So then you have the is-ought fallacy then?
No.
Yes, you do, because you're basically saying that if you conceive of something as wrong, then it must be wrong. It ought to be wrong. There must be a mechanism by which. How do you get from epistemology to ontology?
Here's an analogous argument. Okay, how do I determine that there's grass there? Well, I look and I see there's grass. I don't first figure out a broad theory of how perception works and then say, this broad theory of perception implies that there's a vertical relationship between me seeing the grass and the grass being there. You don't start with a grand theory. You start with obvious first-order judgments, and then you, if anything, you build a grand theory out of there. Now, it's not the is-ought fallacy any more than it would be the grass perception grass fallacy to say, well, I perceive that there's grass, and so from this I infer there's grass. That's not saying that the perception that there's grass and the fact that there's grass are the same thing.
How do you know that your perception is correct? What you consider to be painfully obvious, yeah? How do you know it's painfully obvious? How do you know? How do you prove it?
Well, you get exactly analogous problems in any area where you perceive anything. I see X. How do I know X is really there? There might be other people who didn't perceive X.
You're saying something is painfully obvious. How do you prove that it's painfully obvious?
Well, so normally, I think that if something seems painfully obvious to you, you have reason to trust that it is, in fact, painfully obvious, unless there's some reason to doubt it. Now, this reason to doubt it might be, for instance, in the form of there being, strong arguments against it from other things that are obvious to most people. It might be in the form of lots of other people not sharing the intuition. It might be in the form of some debunking account, some plausible evolutionary story of why you might have come to form the judgment, even if the judgment were not, in fact, true.
No, but you see, once again.
But sorry, is there anything? So suppose the Quran had said, it's great to torture babies. You should just go around torturing babies for fun all the time. Would that be a good reason to reject the truth of the Quran?
If the Quran had said that, it's not. I would say that it would have to give a principle for why. If it does so as a, if it does so just like that, without any reason, then there would be. Because it goes back to whether you can actually prove something is true or false before the revelation goes down. So there are two opinions in Islam about that. One opinion is the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim and the Mu'tazilis, which is called Taqbih and Tahsin. Can you determine something to be true morally before the religion or before the commandment has come down? So that school of thought says you can actually determine. You can do it. And so they would say that some things would maybe pass the threshold, so you can actually make an argument like that if the Quran had such clear, flagrant, moral trespassers of, human rights or whatever, in that level, according to some of those guys, they would say yes, it can reach a level where you can disprove. But the other school of thought, which is the Ash'ari, and to a lesser extent Maturidi, but nevertheless both of them.
Right, okay, so which one do you adopt?
I see the merit in both arguments. I'm more with the Ibn Taymiyyah school of thought on this one. But
sorry, I forget which one the Ibn Taymiyyahs were.
Yeah, so the Ash'aris and others, they believe in divine command theory. So if you know Euthyphro's dilemma, they would consider there is something to be wrong or right due to the fact that God has made it wrong or right. So whatever God has said in the Quran is wrong or right.
Yeah.
Now there's a verse in the Quran that says that Inna Allah la ya'muru bil fahsha, that certainly Allah does not command to something which is evil, which could indicate that the evil has actually been understood before the Quran has been revealed. However, the point about the things, the commandments in the Quran, for example, that would have to be in place in order for someone to come to a conclusion that this book is not from God, it would have to be like an accumulative case. You'd have to make a cumulative case for something like that. But I can see an argument for that. I'm not saying there isn't an argument for that. There is an argument for that. But personally, I don't think the issue is with...
Right, so I think you and I, we agree about the principle that there are some things that the Quran could say that are sufficiently ethically implausible that it would make sense to think the Quran, to treat as at least a strong argument against the veracity of the Quran. We're just disagreeing about whether this is sufficiently implausible. But you haven't given a justification for it.
But here's the thing, Ibn Taymiyyah says the following, though. Considering the fact that he does believe it's possible to ascertain morality before the divine command, right? That's his view. He also mentions the following in his magnum opus, Ta'arub al-Aqli wal-Naql. He says the following. He says that the truth is you can't always trust your intuitions. So it can never reach a level where you can make an argument, a religious argument against a book like the Quran. Let me tell you why. He says that how do you know that the epistemological point that you have, which for example is, in your case, you believe that someone burning in the hellfire is immoral. How do you know that that is he calls it fitra, an innate predispositional feature of what you would otherwise call painfully obvious had it not been for socialization. So in other words, his argument is socialization or secondary socialization causes people to think that some things which they would otherwise have believed are acceptable are not acceptable due to social constructs and secondary socialization. The issue therefore is, when we talk about something which is right or wrong, for people living in the Western Hemisphere, we're not decontextualized from the post-Enlightenment ideas. So a lot of the time what we consider to be immoral or unethical, and I've heard Richard Swinburne as well, things that he considers to be unethical and immoral, things like that are so because of liberalism, are so because of feminism, are so because of whatever ideology has been loudest and most influential, and it's very difficult to actually separate the two things together and say, well, actually, I'm not influenced by liberalism or social liberalism at all. I'm not influenced by any Western ethical system. It's painfully obvious to me because I intuit that, and this could have been the case cross-culturally and historically. So the epistemological case cannot transcend into an ontological one, that's the point. So Ibn Taymiyyah, despite believing it's technically possible, he believes it's operationally impossible to make the kind of argument he made.
Yeah. So sorry. So do you agree? Is there any moral judgments that the Quran could have made that would make it reasonable to at least consider that a strong mark against the Quran's veracity in your view?
The proposition makes sense abstractly, but when it's implemented on a practical level on a human side, it's actually no, because that's what I'm saying is human being is a social creature.
So if the Quran said, when you see kittens in the street, you should just start, burning them alive.
There's a limit though. With the Quran, there are some things that are questionable. But
no, but what I'm saying to you is...
Wait, sorry. If it said that, would that be a mark against the veracity of the Quran?
No.
Okay, right. So
I think at that point, no. At that point, because the thing is, I would question myself, and I would say to myself, is it that I have a certain view of animals due to ethical systems which have preponderated and become influential?
Okay, wait. Replace animals with babies.
Yeah.
Like the killing of
If it said just when you see a baby on the street, you should set it on fire. Would that be a strong argument against the Quran?
Well, that's what the feminists say, isn't it? But the only difference is they say do it in the womb.
Abortion, yeah.
Okay, but okay.
And many people consider that to be painfully obvious, acceptable morality.
Okay.
Bro, like for example, I just came from Holland. Of all due respect, I came from Holland, and they have a law that says up to 6 months a woman can actually abort a child. Now, have you seen what a 6-month child looks like? Bro, look, if you cut up a 6-month child, now it's painfully obvious for a feminist to believe in that. Forget about me.
Sorry.
What the Quran says. Let's talk about the actual things. Feminists, it's painfully obvious for them that a woman has a right to abort a child. It's painfully obvious for a Catholic that that's not the case. So the thing is that there has to be a final arbiter.
So just to be clear, if the Quran said that whenever you see a baby, you should torture it to death, you would think that would not be a decisive mark against the Quran?
Wait,
sorry, just yes or no? Would that be a decisive mark against the Quran?
For me, it's not decisive, no.
Okay.
It's not decisive.
Would that be a substantial bit of evidence against the veracity of the Quran?
It can build into a cumulative case.
Yeah.
Would it be a substantial consideration?
It depends on how you define substantial.
Okay.
But here's what I would say. The issue is that Ibn Taymiyyah says, Ibn Taymiyyah makes the point that because human beings are primarily socialized beings, yeah? Because human beings are socialized, the influence of society on them, on how they see things as right or wrong, it pervades the human psyche in a way that they can't even recognize themselves. What is painfully obvious to you now, morally, would not have been painfully obvious to you 100 years ago. That's the truth.
Right, so I agree.
If John Stuart Mill, what he believes is what most of the West, or a lot of the West believes. And they just believe
we can't assume that 50 years, forget about 100, 50 years ago, things that people like you believe were painfully obvious are different 50 years later.
Right, I agree our beliefs change, and this is a reason to be somewhat, tempered and moderate in our ethical judgments. And it's particularly a reason to trust beliefs more if we think that there's to look at other things as markers of the reliability of our beliefs. So for example, one consideration that people make in favor of vegetarianism is they say, look, historically we've expanded our moral circle. First, people only cared about other members of their own tribe. Later, people cared about members of larger nation states. Eventually, we reached the fairly lukewarm cosmopolitanism of the modern age, where we, sort of ostensibly sometimes care about every human. And so the idea is that if we sort of extrapolate this trend, where we observe there's a common trend of people not caring enough about the interests of others, then we see, it's plausible that there'd be similar things where we wouldn't take animals' interests seriously enough. And so I think you can make arguments like that, where you look at inductive generalizations from moral trends.
Well, as I said, it's to get from epistemology to ontology, to make a real claim about the world, that something is bad or something is wrong, not something that you intuit to be, that you think is, that in your understanding is painfully obvious, which could very well not be. Had you been in a different place in a different time, I think it's a completely different thing, and you can't use that as an argument against religion. Because
I don't think that's right. I do have some other objections that we could talk about. I think I probably have to get going in the not too distant future, but so one of them is, it looks like the depictions that the Quran gives of various figures in the Old Testament are the byproducts of its times in ways that we would not expect of the revelation from God. So take, for instance, the Quranic verses about Solomon. They depict Solomon performing miracles and doing magic. Now this
not magic.
Miracles.
In fact, the opposite is mentioned on that.
Yeah, they believed it to be magic, but it wasn't actually.
No, I mean, so the Quran says in chapter number 2, verse 100, this is وَاتَّبَعُوا مَا تَتْلُو الشَّيَاطِينُ عَلَى مُلْكِ سُلَيْمَانَ وَمَا كَفَرَ سُلَيْمَانُ وَلَكِنَ الشَّيَاطِينَ كَفَرُوا. That it wasn't, that basically there were two angels, I'm going to summarize, there were two angels, Harut and Marut, that came to Solomon, and Allah says that he didn't engage in this, he did not engage in the magic himself. وَمَا كَفَرَ سُلَيْمَانُ وَلَكِنَ الشَّيَاطِينَ كَفَرُوا. Yeah, the devils are the ones who disbelieved. يُعَلِّمُونَ النَّاسَ السِّحْرَ.
Wait, so
they are the ones who teach magic.
Sorry, so it was angels who sort of like served alongside Solomon, and they were the ones who did the magic or the miracles.
Nothing about
They just-
served
they just
alongside.
had the
They just went that these two angels, Harut and Marut, according to the Quran, they went to the people. يُعَلِّمُونَ النَّاسَ السِّحْرَ. They are the ones who taught the people magic. Things that would separate between مَا يُفَرِّقُونَ بِهِ بَيْنَ الْمَرْءِ وَزَوْجِهِ. Something which is separate between a man and his wife.
Let me.
وَلَيْسَ بِضَارِّنَ أَحَدٍ بِأَحَدٍ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. And they were not going to do that with except for the permission of Allah. Yeah. What do you call it? And it says that what do you call it? وَلَقَدْ عَلِمُوا لَمَنْ اشْتَرَاهُ مَا لَهُ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنْ خَلَقٍ. That whoever buys this kind of magic does not have anything in the hereafter, any share in the hereafter. So the point is clearly the Quran is against magic. It's against Solomon, the idea that Sulaiman alayhi salam engaged in it. It's actually exonerating him from the charge. And it describes this sihr, or this magic, as actually a kind of disbelief. And it says that وَمَا كَفَرَ سُلَيْمَانُ وَلَكِنَّ الشَّيَاطِينَ كَفَرُوا. It says that it wasn't Solomon that he disbelieved, it was the devil that did.
Okay, wait. So the Quran claims that Solomon did not perform magic.
That's right.
Was there magic that was like circulating around the time?
Yeah, it was, but it wasn't him. He wasn't engaged in it himself.
Right. Why do we find no record of this in Kings and Chronicles?
That's an argument from silence.
Yeah, that's
Well, I don't think it's an argument from silence because
of course it is.
what we've observed historically is that tales tend to grow wilder over time. So it would be very surprising if there was magic that was happening at the time. The people at the time who were writing about it didn't see fit to mention the magic of the time, but that the stories, which were suspiciously similar to the stories that were circulating around 7th century Arabia, that they grow more accurate over time.
All right, so let me respond to you. Obviously, Solomon and David are two extra biblical, if you want to put it in the modern parlance, prophets that are mentioned both in the Old Testament and the Quran, right? And in fact, Dawood or David, I would say about 20 years ago, there was a historian called Israel Finkelstein, not Norman Finkelstein. There's another one called Israel Finkelstein, and this particular historian had taken the view that David did not even exist. Yeah, he said that there's no extra biblical evidence that David even existed. Then they came across something called the Tel Dan Stele. The Tel Dan Stele is basically a big piece of rock, which is mentioned in it, the House of David. So Israel Finkelstein, who was an atheist or secular historian, changed his mind upon seeing new information about David that wasn't there in the first place. Now, it's respected among historians of that period of time that David and Solomon, in fact, both existed. So this is in 20 years. That's why arguments from silence are very weak. Because in 20 years, historians can find some kind of a record, some kind of a rock. That's number one.
It's very similar to moral arguments.
Yeah. So number two is this. I think what he considers to be an objection of Islam is exactly an argument for the veracity of Islam. Because some of the things that I mentioned in the Quran, which are historical aspects, could not have been known by the Prophet Muhammad. Or the probability of them being known by the Prophet Muhammad would have been exponentially low.
What regarding Solomon? What are the examples involving like David and Solomon?
No, David and Solomon, we don't have even that much historical information, so they're not good case studies. But I think when we get to Moses onwards, we got good case studies. So Moses, if we consider the fact that he's Ramses II, okay? Pharaoh,
yeah.
Pharaoh is Ramses II, yeah? According to the majority of those who analyze it, and they've got good reason to believe that, by the way. So, for example, his Ramses II came after a guy called Mereological. Mereological, like I said, with the Tel Dan stele, had his own stele. And in that stele, he'd mentioned Bani Israel once again. But now he said that we had kicked them out. It's mentioned the 17th line of his stele.
He was the son of Ramses II.
So, yeah, sorry. He came after him, yeah?
Right.
So that's right. So if he came after and he said we kicked them out, it means that his father's the one who saw it, what happened. So it's clearly a history that he's narrating upon his father's reign. So
also at the beginning of the book of Exodus, it says that the Israelites built the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. And Ramses presumably was...
Yeah, exactly. So that's a lot of the reason why I say that, because it's Ramses II. Now there's claims the Quran makes about Ramses II, which are not even found in the Bible. Yeah. There are claims the Quran makes about...
600 king and Pharaoh.
That's something else.
What are some of the claims?
So some of the claims are the following, right? So it says that he believed in that he was a god. He says, "Anna rabbukumul a'la." Okay, the Bible there's nowhere in the Bible where it says that Ramses II claimed divinity. Nowhere. The Quran says that he says, "Ana rabbukum al-a'la," that I'm your Lord Most High. Yeah, it's mentioned in Quran chapter number 7 that he said, not only did he say that I'm your Lord Most High, but Ramses II also mentioned, that the Pharaoh also said that there were other peoples, there were other gods that were being worshipped. أَتَذْرُ مُوسَى وَقَوْمَهُ لِيُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَيَذَرَكَ وَآلِهَتَكَ. It's what's mentioned in the Quran. It says that, do you leave Moses and his people to create corruption in the land? وَيَذَرَكَ وَآلِهَتَكَ. And they leave you and your gods. So clearly, two claims. Yeah. One, that Pharaoh said that he was God. There's good evidence from a historical perspective, it's actually uncontroversial now, that Pharaoh, these guys claim divinity, number one.
Did we find this out after we got the Rosetta Stone?
Yes.
And then,
so, good point. So this information, don't forget, hieroglyphics were a dead language. Exactly. There is no access. The Prophet Muhammad had no access to the hieroglyphics because we only found out about what these things meant when the Rosetta Stone came, which is, I don't know when that was.
100
maybe.
100 also.
What was that? When was that discovered?
Found it, and it was translated in the 1820s.
Exactly the year, yeah. But it was I went to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. They've got like a duplicate of it and stuff.
The original is in the British Museum here.
Yeah, I know. They've stolen it.
British Museum, Egyptian Museum.
Yeah. But the point I'm making is this: is that you can go to the British Museum and try to look at. What was it? 1800, 1700, 17 something?
Napoleon found it, and it was given to the British took it in the early 1800s.
Yeah, there you go.
And that it wasn't translated for another 20-something years.
I thought
the 1820s is when they were.
Yeah, so for those,
I thought that they.
So that's sorry.
I thought they'd known for a while that the pharaohs claimed to be gods. Maybe they didn't know it. Well, even if it wasn't mentioned in the Bible.
That's the way they get it from. So here's the thing. Think about what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, right? The claim that people make about him is that he copied from the Bible. That's the claim they make. They say he copied. Okay, but here's the thing.
But it doesn't have to be that he copied every claim.
Here's the point. Where did he get this information? Yeah? This is the Quran makes this argument actually. It says, you didn't know about this. We gave you this information. You couldn't have known this, yeah?
Sorry, can you just tell me the verse that you're referring to?
Which ones?
The one.
So there's lots. For example, when it says that "Ana rabbukum al-a'la" is mentioned in multiple places in the Quran. So it's in Nazi'at chapter number 79, verse number 15 or 14 or something like that.
I have an English.
Wait, sorry.
I have an English copy.
Okay.
Yeah, chapter number 79. What was it? Verse 14, 15? Can you find out for me?
Also the name of Haman.
Yeah, that will come. But I'll give him one at a time. It says "Ana rabbukum al-a'la." He says "Ana rabbukum." Faqala "Ana rabbukum."
Sorry, 79 verse what?
24.
24. That's the one.
Said but he denied and disobeyed. Then he turned his back, striving, and he gathered his people and called out.
He says, "I'm your Lord Most High." Yeah? Yeah, no, I'll come to that. But we were doing one at a time. There's so many elements here, so many aspects.
So I can't comment in any detail on these claims. I haven't looked into them carefully.
Sure.
But Mormons say the same thing.
Mormons religion. When was that? They had the library. Go to the library and find that out information.
Can I have your water? Because I need to break my fast.
Yeah, that's not water. It's finished.
I know anything will do.
Okay,
you want me to bring water?
Where is it?
I don't know. Can you get it?
I'll get it.
This should do.
So here's the first point number one. It's mentioned. Is it Maghrib?
It's very soon.
Very soon.
One second.
So, point. Excellent. So, as we mentioned, number one, historically, this information could not. It's implausible, or let's just say it's highly improbable. Yeah, for someone to claim that the Prophet ﷺ got this information himself. Why? It's making a claim about ancient Egyptian history, and there's no record of any of that stuff outside of the Old Testament. Yeah, even that there was no copy of the Old Testament, but that's the only thing someone could say. Okay, well he copied from the Old Testament, but there's nothing in the Old Testament at all of Pharaoh claiming to be God. Number one. Number two, that there were other gods aside God that were being worshipped in Egypt. Number three, and this is a classic one we use, but I'm going to use it.
Wait, sorry, that there were other gods being there are lots of gods being worshipped most of the time, and that doesn't seem like a very impressive prediction.
Yeah, but that's
No, I know, to make the claim.
What I'm saying is that it's painting. You're mentioning the historical thing. I'm saying if you look at the details, the historical details here, these are details. Is giving you a complete image, and that image we have found out because of the Rosetta Stone, because we'll be able to unlock the hieroglyphics. Number 3.
Can I interrupt for
Sure.
1 second on that? So, I just Googled it. Genesis Rabbah, which is a
Midrashim, yeah.
source. It's a 89:3. Involves Pharaoh describing himself as a god over the Nile River. So at least according to Jews, Genesis, I don't remember when it was written in the early...
That was written before the Prophet Muhammad, but then it wasn't compiled at his time. So according to Nusna, Jacob Nusna, who's a Jewish scholar,
Yes, I have a couple of his books.
he's actually one of the most prolific writer of all time.
He's written 8 billion books.
I think he's written 900 and something. He's got the record for the most books written by a human being, I think.
Yes, I have one of his books on Midrash.
Yeah.
But-
That's the one I'm talking about.
Right.
So that one
Well,
there,
it's
yeah.
many that you're talking about. But-
Genesis, the plausibility that Genesis Rabbah would have been available in the Arabian Peninsula.
No, zero. But
Yeah.
the fact is that Jews at the time also would not have acknowledged that, unless it was common knowledge, that pharaohs thought of themselves as God. So Ramses wasn't the only pharaoh to think of himself as God. Certainly later pharaohs, all the way up to the Ptolemaic times. So the idea that pharaohs thought of themselves as divine beings, as did many ancient kings in the ancient Near East, might have been common knowledge. I don't find it that surprising that Genesis Rabbah or Muhammad or any other person.
Yeah,
at the
but
time
it's a
might have-
cumulative case. So we're saying,
Okay, fair enough.
because he started off by saying...
But I guess that, right, so that particular instance doesn't seem like a particularly compelling instance.
No, but it's an interesting one, isn't it? So if you add that, is it accurate or inaccurate? For example, it could be
It is an
falsified.
interesting
Yeah,
one.
because if you say that, okay, well, we're looking for aspects which are falsifiable. So for example, if the Quran had made the point or the claim that they didn't claim divinity, then we can disprove it. You see the point?
Yeah.
So
There's multiple
there's one. That's we said. Number 1, Pharaoh. Number 2, it says in the Quran, فَالْيَوْمْ نُنَجِّيكَ بِبَدَنِكَ لِتَكُونَ لِمَنْ خَلْفَكَ آيَةً. Yeah, in chapter 10 of the Quran, Surah Yunus, it says that we will preserve your body so that you can be for those who come after you as a reminder. So the Quran is making a claim. Assalamu alaikum, how are you doing? You okay? MashaAllah, you're right, good to see you. Assalamu alaikum, hi brother, you okay? Good to see you, MashaAllah, you're right. I didn't say it again. Pakistan, how are you? You okay? Good to see you, man. So it says that today we will preserve your body so you can be a sign, an evidence, a piece of evidence for those who come after you. But Ramses II, at the time of Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt at the time, who was famous for the Camp David Agreement and the settlement and the peace treaty that he done with Israel, he brought the body of Ramses II into Egypt, and he did so with red carpet treatment, because he said that it's a bit ridiculous considering he's a Muslim and this guy's meant to be like the main antagonist of the Quran. But the point is, he brought him in, and his body is there in Egypt right now. You can Google his image. You can see what Ramses II looks like. Ramses II, body has been preserved. The Quran states that, so this is a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. You can say, okay, well, we don't believe in this and that, but we say this is a prediction of the future now. It's getting more and more interesting.
But so just regarding the claims about Solomon, so I think it's a fairly substantial point against the Quran if the stories about the time around the time described much less grand magical activity regarding at the time. A thing that we know is that stories don't tend to that were passed from word of mouth don't tend to underrate the exciting bits, the bits involving magic and so on and so forth. So it would be very surprising.
The Kabbalah and all that stuff, where do you think it comes from? They believe that they got the magic from under the Temple of Solomon.
Normally you have to wait till...
Okay, but that's not what they talk about in Kings and Chronicles. There's no description of them engaging in magic.
Nevertheless, that's not the entirety of the corpus of the Jews. So the idea of magic is clear. There's tracts written. I think Maimonides wrote a book on magic. They all bring it back to Solomon's era and the temple.
Right. So here, what you're saying is perfectly compatible with the account I'm giving. So here's the account I'm giving. Basically, David and Solomon were fairly ordinary kings. Then, over time, the stories grew wilder and wilder until they were claimed to be that magic was running rampant in their time. Then this got later attributed by people around the time of Maimonides to David and Solomon. And in addition, this influenced the views of Muhammad, which he then wrote down.
Maimonides came after Muhammad.
That's perfectly compatible with what I said.
Did you just say that Maimonides then Muhammad was influenced? That's what you just said.
I may have. I didn't know the ordering between, but it doesn't. The ordering doesn't matter for my point.
Well, there's a good 1,000 years or something, or 800 years between the two people. So I don't know how someone 800 years later can be influenced by someone that came by 100 years before him.
I wasn't saying Muhammad was influenced by Maimonides.
So what then?
What I was saying was that the stories grew wilder over time, and these wilder stories were responsible for what both Muhammad and Maimonides wrote down.
Okay. Well, as I said, there's a I don't know how many years difference between Prophet Muhammad, who died 631, and Maimonides, who was in the 12th century or something.
He was in the Caliphate.
Yeah, Salah al-Ayyubi, right? So 12th century. Or something.
It doesn't matter when they live relative to each other.
700 years apart, right?
Influenced by Avicenna and Averroes.
Who was?
Maimonides.
Exactly, right. So he was clearly influenced by the Muslims. I mean, Maimonides, when he wrote the book, The Guide to the Perplexed, which is Dala al-Ha'irin, where if you look at how much, more so I think Ibn Rushd actually, Averroes, than Ibn Sina.
Yeah,
He cites them explicitly. Moron Nabuccan is the Hebrew, yes.
So yeah, the idea that, Maimonides, I think he's aside the point. If anything, he's been influenced more by Islam than the opposite. I mean, most of his ideas are Islamic. If you look at his book, Islamic philosophers and thinkers.
Well, Aristotelian, but
yeah, true. But through Ibn Rushd.
Islam drew on Islamic philosophers drew on Aristotle, as did Maimonides.
Agreed.
As did Thomas Aquinas.
So he got a lot of it from Ibn Rushd.
Right,
I mean, Thomas Aquinas' third way, for example, is
But I mean, look, the basic point is what we would expect on the hypothesis that the Quran was not directly dictated by God is we would expect that the things that the stories that would go into the Quran would resemble much more the circulating Arabic legends of the time than they would resemble what the earliest sources say about the subject. Because otherwise you have to think that, strangely, as the tales grew wilder over time, they got more accurate, which never happens.
So there is no evidence on it. So usually people who make the argument of the circulating Arabic tales, they do so vis-a-vis, for example, Alexander legends and so on, with chapter 18 of the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf. They don't do so with this point because there wasn't really any circulating Arab legends on this front. Don't forget also that
I think we do have. I think we do have examples. We certainly have examples of legends about David and Solomon that grew wilder in the later periods,
but
where the tales about them grew wilder.
Your main argument was this: you're saying that the Quran mentioning that there's some kind of magical activity happening at the time of Solomon is somehow undermining of the Quranic narrative. Now, I'm saying point number one, this would be considered to be an argument from silence in historical terms. And even if you do make this argument, you need to understand, especially with David and Solomon, as I mentioned before, people like Israel Finkelstein, who have retracted their positions in a span of 20 years after steles like the Tel Dan stele has been found, should be enough evidence for you to realize that you shouldn't be quick to make a judgment, especially as a non-historian, because you have historians making these judgments and then retracting them 20 years, especially vis-a-vis David and Solomon. But then what we can analyze is that which can be falsified regarding the historical record, regarding David and Solomon, and regarding Moses. As I mentioned, what already has been mentioned in the Quran relating to Moses, the fact that Pharaoh had claimed to be God, the fact that there were other gods that were being worshipped at the time of Pharaoh, and the fact that Pharaoh's body will be preserved. These are just three examples, and there are so many other examples like this. Haman, the mentioning of this Haman, a person called Haman, obviously Maurice Bucquoy wrote an entire book on it, the French historians and scientists. He wrote a whole book on the Egypt, and I think called the Egypt in the Quran or something like that. But the point is that in that book he says that these names, he went and found in primary source information that these names of the people at the time of Pharaoh were the very names that were actually there at the time of Pharaoh, at the time of Ramses II. So you have very specific information. And then you add to that, which everyone knows this classic one, the fact that, for example, in the book of Genesis, you have the story of Joseph. And in chapter 12 of the Quran, the surah of Joseph, you have the same story. And bear in mind, Joseph is located also in Egypt. But then you find that when Joseph in the Quran is discussing with the sovereign of Egypt at the time, he was referring to him as a king. whereas Moses was referring to the sovereign of that time as a pharaoh. And now it has essentially been confirmed that the Bible was wrong and the Quran was right. So this is a clear-cut case of the Quran actually historically correcting the Bible on something which in the...
Wait, I'm sorry, make the argument again?
Let me make the argument.
Yeah.
So in the book of Genesis,
Yes.
you have the discussion of Joseph.
Yes.
Okay, Joseph. And in the Quran, you also have Joseph being mentioned. Yeah?
Okay.
Now, if you look at most historians, whether they be Christian, Muslim, or otherwise, they locate Joseph at the time of the Upper Intermediate period. This is the Hyksos dynasty. The Hyksos dynasty was not a dynasty of pharaohs. It was a dynasty of kings. And so the Quran depicts Joseph as having an interaction with what he calls to be a king of the sovereign of Egypt at that time, whereas the Bible in the book of Genesis calls him Pharaoh. So the question is,
even the,
yeah.
I mean, look, I was just in the British Museum.
Sure.
So even the leaders at that time, I mean, first of all, the Hyksos came and went, so it's not clear exactly if the Israelites at the time were identified with the Hyksos. But there were pharaohs going all the way back to the first dynasty who used the term pharaoh. So there was actually a couple pharaohs during that time, and I can't remember the names, but there's part of the exhibit on Egyptology at the British Museum talking about pharaohs that are not in the list of pharaohs. I mean, the pharaohs would often say, I'm so-and-so, and here's all my predecessors that were named pharaohs. There were pharaohs that they found during that period who were pharaohs but were not in the list. But they found their sarcophagi and so on. But I don't have any reason to think that the leaders of Egypt at the time of the Hyksos did not also call themselves pharaohs.
Yeah, so I've looked into this myself in secondary source material, and I think it's almost a matter of consensus.
Okay.
So this point here is almost a matter of consensus that at that time of Joseph, which is meant to be situated, and they use it through genealogies and stuff like that, that was in the Hyksos period, and at that time it was a king and not a pharaoh. So the point I'm making is, look, think of the following. Anyway, we all agree that the Hyksos dynasty, they had kings. The fact that the Quran's even mentioning the word king here, where it's deviating from the norm, because the norm is pharaoh. Like every single time Moses speaks to the sovereign of Egypt, he says pharaoh, Pharaoh in Arabic. It's the Arabized version of the word pharaoh, or the Hebrew equivalent. But what I'm saying is, why is it Joseph is saying Melik? He's speaking to the king. It's a different word, and it's the same location, geographic location. It indicates a very precise, sophisticated knowledge that could not, I mean, it's very implausible. Once again, it's a cumulative case. When you add all these things together, when you add the things I've just mentioned together, the fact that we all accept now the Rosetta Stone was, discovered in the 1800s and this information couldn't have been known, the historical argument for the veracity of Islam. I mean, let's be honest, it's pretty impressive. I mean, the Bible itself has no equivalent to this.
Well, certainly the Greeks and the Persians knew something about the divinity of pharaohs, or the pharaoh's claims of divinity. And that was common knowledge, even without, deciphering hieroglyphics.
What Greeks? Which ones?
Pardon?
What Greeks? Which ones? The Greeks, which?
I don't know offhand, but certainly there was Greek.
Yeah. Well, the Greek translation, the Greek translation project took place in 300 AH, which is 300 years after the Prophet's death. But there was no Greek texts that were translated into Arabic at that time. In fact, the Arabs didn't even have, until the Abbasid period, the golden age of Islam, any access to this, the Greek texts and so on. So it's a...
Oh, I see. You're talking about the Arab world.
Yeah, because if the point is that they got this from the Greeks.
My point is that, okay, I partially grant your point, but it may be that it was just common knowledge in the ancient world that pharaohs...
Oh, but the ancient world was not one monolithic entity.
No, but most ancient kings thought of themselves as gods.
I don't know. I think that's a subject of dispute.
Kings did. I know that.
Yeah, fine. But when we put all of these things together, if I were to ask the simple question, was the Quran accurate or inaccurate in depicting.
Right.
So and then we go through all the things that we just said. Was it accurate or inaccurate in depicting that
But-
Pharaoh was going to be
But of
preserved?
course-
Is it accurate or inaccurate? You have so many accuracies that could have otherwise been. So these accuracies could have otherwise been inaccurate.
Yeah. But I think
And then
I
you
guess
have no
I think.
inaccuracies as well.
Well, I would dispute you have no inaccurate. Like,
Okay, well, you have to find one.
Yeah.
You can't just disagree. You have
well,
to find one.
so for instance, I think the passage about the sun setting in muddy spring.
Again,
Yeah, so he says that when Dhul Qarnayn وجدها تغرب في عين حامئة, he saw it going into a muddy spring. He doesn't say that he believes that the sun goes into a muddy spring. The Quran says, وَكُلٌّ فِي فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ in chapter number 36, number 40. It says that, it talks about the sun. Some scholars even say it talks about the earth as well, because it says that it starts by وَآيَةٌ لَهُمُ الْأَرْضُ الْمَيْتَةُ أَحْيَيْنَاهَا وَأَخْرَجْنَا مِنْهَا حَبًّا وَمِنْهَا تَخْرُجُونَ and so on and so forth. And then it goes وَالشَّمْسُ تَجْرِي لِمُسْتَقَرٍّ لَهَا ذَلِكَ تَقْدِيرُ الْعَزِيزِ الْعَلِيمِ لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. Right? So the Quran mentions, it starts by talking about the earth, and then it talks about the sun, and then it talks about the moon. Chapter number 36, verse number 40. And it says that they're all revolving around in an orbit with their own motion. Ibn Abbas, who is considered to be the most authoritative companion of the Prophet and someone who interpreted these verses, he brought a spinning wheel to demonstrate what the Quran actually meant by this. That's why the scholars of Islam, even pre-modernity, for example, At-Tabari and Ibn Kathir and others, they looked at the verse just for the lay person who doesn't understand the verse in chapter number 18, verse number 86, where it talks about, وَجَدَهَا تَقْرُبُ فِي عَيْنٍ حَمِئَةٍ, that Dhul Qarnayn saw the sun going into the muddy spring. And they say that this is not saying that the sun, this is not saying the sun does that, because we know that the sun has its own orbits and so on and so forth. So we have classical scholars that go back and say all of these things. In fact, there's no verse in the Quran which indicates something against what we know. Comparative to the Bible, look at the Bible. The only verse in the Bible, according to John Walton, a Christian scholar in America, based in America, he says there's only one verse in the Bible which indicates that the earth may be round. And that's in the book of Isaiah, chapter number 40, verse number 22, where it's mentioned the circle of the earth. The circle of the earth. But even he said that when you have the circle of the earth and it's flat, it's depicted as flat, it's a disc.
It's a different kind of...
So there's nothing in the Bible, there is no explanation, even on the rotundity of the earth. There is no explanation, unless you want to metaphorize, as the Christians have been doing now, because they have been found out with the Genesis narrative. And there is no equivalent to Genesis chapter 1, verse number 1 to 20, where it talks about the sun being created on the third day.
Is it Genesis, I believe, is it that the metaphorical one, or is it...
they say it's metaphoric, but that's the only person in the ancient period who said that was Origen of Alexandria, who's considered to be an ecumenical church council writer. He's not even considered to be a saint. Him and his Jewish teacher Philo in the Alexandrian school. But the majority, for example, if you consider the other church fathers, they actually consider this all to be 100% literal. In fact, in fact, Augustine himself wrote on the literal interpretation. This is a book that he wrote on the literal interpretation of Genesis.
But then there would be a lot more problems that way as well.
Of course there'll be problems. But there's problems either way, because even if it's not, even if you don't want to talk about it being, let's say, the book of Genesis says that there's night and day on the first day, but then on the third day, the fourth day, the sun was created. I want to know how there was a night and day without the sun. And on the third day, vegetation was there. But then on Genesis chapter 2, verse number 5, it says no plant has sprung up yet. So is there plants or no plants? So much so that William...
No plant has sprung up because there hadn't been rain yet. So
I'm
not defending it. But the argument is the plants were in the ground but hadn't sprouted yet. Because there were no...
But and you got on the third day, you got all the shrubberies and all the trees, and everything is there. And there's no photosynthesis because the sun wasn't there on the fourth day. So it looks like, as William Craig said, I mean, this is what Craig said. He said the following. He said that it looks like honestly, you can Google this. He says that it looks like the author of the Bible did not care if there's contradictions inside of it. This is William Craig.
William Lane Craig himself.
So what I'm trying to say to you
well,
is...
so it talks about the setting point. It doesn't just say he saw like the reflection in a spring. It says he found the setting point of the sun. Like, there's not a specific point where the sun sets.
Yeah, all right. So as I mentioned, the Quran mentions in chapter number 39, verse number 5, يُكَوِّرُ اللَّيْلُ عَلَى النَّهَارِ وَيُكَوِّرُ النَّهَارَ عَلى اللَّيْلِ وَسَخَّرَ الشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ كُلٌّ يَجْرِي لِأَجَلٍ مُسَمَّى. In chapter number 39, which is Surah Zumar, where Allah mentions that He rolls the day into the night, and He rolls the night into the day, and He creates the day, وَسَخَّرَ الشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ, and He made subordinate the sun and the moon. كُلٌّ يَجْرِي لِأَجَلٍ مُسَمَّى. All of them are going to an appointed time. Now, Ibn Hazm, who is a...
Wait, if that they're all going to an appointed time doesn't,
No, but let me tell you what he said. Ibn Hazm, who's in the 4th century scholar, 400 years after the Prophet, classical interpretation of this verse, he says this indicates the earth is round. In his book Al-Fisal.
Why does it indicate
He says
that?
because there's no way, the word yukawiru comes from the word kura, which means ball. And you cannot have this motion, he says, it's impossible. You cannot have this motion unless you have a ball. That's what he says. Now, someone could say, well, that's you're doing apologetics. Yeah. It doesn't look like Ibn Hazm, who lived in 400 years after the Prophet ﷺ died, has any modern reason to try and say that the earth is round. Whereas in the Bible it says that the earth is flat. And there's no interpretation of a classical nature or type that indicates that the earth is round from a literal reading of the Bible. So if you believe the earth is round, and you also believe in literally interpreting the Quran and the Bible, you have to believe in the Quran. You cannot believe in the Bible. Finish.
Why? I have more things to say. I think I should probably get going, but it was nice meeting you.
Thank you very much, brother, yeah?
Yeah, thank you. Have a nice day.
It's true, though, isn't it? You're a very intelligent man. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So an
You want to take a
imam.
seat? Yeah, take a seat. Take that as well, and you can talk to me a little bit. I think I need to pray, actually. Yeah.
Why? I think he and I have likely. He's my dad, so I think it's likely we have.
Do you want to take a seat?
Oh, thanks, sir. Yes.
Thank you.
So a lot of it is still applicable to the Old Testament and stuff like that.
Do you want to sit down?
Take a seat.
No, just a quick question. So an imam spoke at our synagogue, and in response to a question about...
Give him the microphone. Who's got the microphone? No, because these other guys who are watching it, I don't know, all this. Give him one as well.
Oh, okay.
I have to go.
We'll just put it on there or something. Yeah, sorry.
Talking about... Well, I have to go in a minute.
No, of course.
Talking about the verse in the Quran that talked about how the Torah had been modified by Jews for pecuniary gain, or monetary gain. Could you explain that verse and what it means? And am I missing something? Or?
Yeah, no, I think you've So for example, there, like you said, chapter 2, verse 79. But that one is, where it says that فَوَيْلٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَكْتُبُونَ الْكِتَابَ ويل للذين يكتبون الكتاب بأيديهم ثم يقولون هذا من عند الله ليشتروا به ثمنا قليلا فويل لهم بما كتبت أيديهم وويل لهم مما يكسبون. That basically, that woe to those who change the word with their own hand. Okay, ليشتروا به ثمنا قليلا, so they can buy with it a paltry price, miserly price. Now this could be taken metaphorically. It doesn't have to be actually monetary. It could be ثمنا قليلا could mean like worldly gain of some sort. It doesn't have to necessarily be money that's been given.
So is it saying that actually happened, or is it saying that woe to anyone who does that? But
no, it says that they done it. So for example, in chapter 3 it says الذين هادوا, the Jews, يحرفون الكلمة عن مواضعه ونسوا حظا مما ذكروا به. That the Jews changed the book with their own hand. And chapter number 3, verse I think 189 or something like that, it says فَنَبَذُوهُ وَرَاءَ ظُهُورِهِمْ. They threw it behind their books. So this idea of the books have been changed, the Bible has been changed by the rabbis at that time for some kind of worldly gain, whether it's monetary or otherwise, but some kind of worldly gain is clearly there in the Quran. And I would argue that it's clear that there has been changes in the Bible, and these things, if you talk about the Old Testament, because obviously you don't believe in the new one, but the Old Testament you'll find
exists.
Yeah, it exists, but that's not true. But the point is, if you look at the different texts, so you have the Masoretic texts, you have the Septuagint, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are the three main manuscripts that No, this is.
That's the Bible.
No, we're talking about the Old Testament.
Well, there's the Samaritan Torah, there is the
Sure.
Aramaic Peshitas. There's the,
Yeah, but they're all different. The point is that they're all different.
Well, they're largely the same. But,
Yeah, sure. Largely the same, but there's huge, massive differences between.
certainly in the Septuagint.
Yeah, exactly. Because just for those who don't know, Septuagint is not even in Hebrew. It has to be translated out of Greek into Hebrew. So you have a text here, which is basically another language.
The Targums and the Peshitas are in Aramaic and Syriac. And
Exactly. So this is the kind of thing which, when you look at the
So
discrepancies.
that's not changed. So the Masoretic text is accepted as the authoritative Hebrew version. That is very closely matches with a handful of almost scribal errors. What we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls have every book of the Bible except one, the Book of Esther. Not complete, but certainly fragments or parts of all of them. And for the most part, they are identical with a handful of scribal errors and copyist errors, that sort of thing. But, I mean, you'd have to go back further than the Dead Sea Scrolls. But by the Jews, did he mean the rabbis, like of the Talmudic period?
That's right. So, for example, there's lots of criticism of the Quran about those particular rabbis, even compared to donkeys. مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها in chapter 62, Surah Jumu'ah.
Criticism by the Quran of those rabbis.
Yes.
Okay.
مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا. That is like a donkey with books on his back. Those particular ones. So the Quran has praise and dispraise of Jews. I mean, in fact, this is the only book, to be fair, that says that the Bani Israel, the children of Israel, were chosen people. I mean, it's the only other book that says that.
Allah favored them.
Yeah, favored them, is chosen.
But I'm
No,
just
even
trying to
chosen.
figure out,
وَلَقَدْ اخْتَرْنَاهُمْ عَلَىٰ عِلْمٍ عَلَى
Is
الْعَالَمِينَ.
there any mention or commentary that discusses what parts of the Bible have been changed?
There are indications. So, for example, so the Prophet ﷺ told us that if a Jew or a Christian comes to you with the news, لا تصدقوه ولا تكذبوه. He says, do not believe them and do not disbelieve in them. Yeah. So, unless now, there's only one thing about that, which is that if it contradicts the Quran. So clearly, if something contradicts the Quran, it shows the error of that. So, for example, let me give you examples. The story of Lot and having sex with his daughters. That's something we would disagree, because we say that the prophets are infallible, and Lot is free from such a abhorrent and condemnable act. The whole story of Noah showing his nakedness to his sons, Ham, Sam, and Sapeth, and one of them.
Well, he didn't show his nakedness.
well,
Ham uncovered his nakedness.
Whatever, all of that stuff. Or, for example, David as well, and all that. The adultery of Solomon. And,
Noah was a victim, not a perpetrator.
no problem. Maybe Noah is not a good example. But all of these other things that we've just said here,
David.
like David as well.
And Bathsheba.
Yeah, exactly. So there's so many things like that. The sexual immoralities, we say that's not ascribable to the prophets, for example.
So why would the rabbis of the Talmud change the story of King David and make him less admirable?
It's a great question.
What they have from that? That would say that the ancestor of the Messiah was a bad guy, not a good guy. That seems like an odd change to make.
It does, and sometimes motivations of human beings are very difficult to ascertain. I mean, if someone had like a psychiatrist at the time that can come and say that why are these guys doing this? Maybe they've been paid. Maybe some Roman came and said, you know what, sell out your religion, do this. Anything like that could very well be the case. He could be a religious hypocrite. He could be not actually committed to the cause of Judaism in that sense. It could be some person who's a hypocrite to the cause. He wants to destroy Judaism from inside.
Several of them were martyrs in the Roman period. The story of King David is also repeated in the Book of Chronicles as well as the Book of Samuel.
But you see the point of the sexual immoralities. Like, what is the reason why Lot had sex with his daughters? What do we get from that? What moral guidance do I get from that?
The commentary is he was drunk and they tricked him and he thought the world had ended. So he was badly mistaken. Modern scholars say
Right, he's getting drunk.
it's a teleological explanation. I mean, it's a way of sort of making fun of the two enemy neighbors of Israel, like the Ammonites and the Moabites. Moab means from my father, and Ammon is Ami is my father. So the modern explanation is that, I mean, it would be analogous to in America.
Take care, brother. Take care, inshallah. Yeah.
If corny example, but I think it illustrates the point. If someone wanted to make fun of Mexico and Canada, they said, well, Canada got its name because they drank soft drink that made them stupid, can of duh. And Mexico, they were all mixed up, so they called it Mexico. I mean, it's sort of a corny wordplay.
Yeah.
Right?
No, but yeah, it's things like that.
Making fun of two neighboring countries. These two neighboring countries were enemies at the time of Israel.
Sure.
And so you have some of them. There's lots of stories in the Torah that are what scholars call etiological. That is, they provide an explanation.
Mythological.
Not mythological.
Well, I mean, you might as well say this,
So, for example,
it has a spiritual meaning.
I think we should get to
Okay, so just to wrap up this point, and then I have to go. In Genesis, I guess 21, immediately before the Abraham sacrificing Isaac story, there's a much less interesting story where Abraham and Avimelech make a treaty, and they name Beersheba. Beersheba means 7 wells, but also the 7 oaths. And so it's the origin of the name, but it's got a double meaning. So it looks like it's not a lie, but it may be a mythological story, but it may have been accurate, but certainly an etiological story. That is, it is offered to explain where something came from.
I know that's what they have to say, because a lot of the stories in the Bible, including the Amalek and killing this genocides and all these kind of things, they have to have some explanation for it. So they either metaphorize it or they have to reject it. And so we've got these things in the Bible which clearly you can see the word of man has entered. Like, for example, Ezekiel, chapter number 23, verse number 21, if you guys know what I'm talking about. It's the porno, basically. It's talking about the penis and this and the size of this and that. I mean, what kind of moral guidance am I getting of that? If we were getting, what do you call it, Ezekiel 23, 21, if someone brings that out and reads it, I mean, tell me if you would bring that and read it to your daughter, for example. Do you want to bring it?
They describe the parts, like
Ezekiel.
donkeys and...
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It was nice chatting with you on that note. Whose are these? I'll put them.
Okay, I'm gonna go prepare them as well. Yeah. All right, sure. I'm gonna put this on the chair, and then the guys can sort it out. Can I?
He's got to take the chairs. He's winding them up.
No, but this is mine. So I'm gonna put it here, and here's the thing as well. If anyone says anything, this is the thing. Yeah.